NATO, from my experience, is a very bureaucratic and deliberative body, but we've only known a sort of a peacetime NATO. It was basically assumed in the West, among NATO circles, that it would be the Baltic states, that Russia would attack the Baltic states and try and separate them, essentially, from the rest of NATO. That's more complicated now because Finland adds a gigantic border with NATO. I think Russia would actually very quickly find itself short of some of its most vital systems, its air defense, its aircraft. If there were a high-intensity, full-scale conflict between NATO and Russia, unless it immediately went nuclear, in the sense that, de-escalation had to happen or there would be a nuclear exchange, I think any conventional action would have to include Ukraine.
Hello everyone, and welcome to This Week in Ukraine, a show where the newsroom of the Kyiv Independent dives into Ukraine's biggest events of the week and explains them in just 30 minutes. I'm your host, Masha Lavrova. Today, we're talking about the risk of an escalation between Russia and NATO, and if Europe is ready for a potential Russian attack. For the very first time, we're sitting down with somebody outside of the Kyiv Independent, more specifically Marcel Plichta, a security expert who's a fellow at the Global Law and Governance Center in the University of St. Andrews, and a former intelligence analyst at the U.S. Department of Defense. Marcel, welcome to the show. Before we go on, I would like to remind you guys to subscribe to the Kyiv Independent wherever you're listening to this show. Like us, rate us, and leave comments. It will take you only a few seconds, but it really goes a long way for us. Your support is important to us. Thanks to you, we can ensure more people can stay informed about the news in Ukraine. Okay, Marcel, thanks again for joining us today. So we wanted to talk to you about the growing concern in the West about the risk of Russian attack against NATO and the apparent preparations that are seemingly already on their way for this kind of a crazy scenario. So to begin, I wanted to ask you, what do you think the warnings of an escalation between NATO and Russia, that they've been piling up recently, and why now?
That's an interesting question. Why now? Why now is probably because Russia has been engaged in Ukraine for close to 2 years now, over 2 years now. And they are seeing sort of a weakening of resolve, I think, from the West, or at least what perceives to be a weakening of resolve from the West. You're seeing, American politicians sort of use Ukraine as a sort of a chess piece a little bit back and forth. And I think that they see an opportunity to exert more pressure on NATO, more pressure on the alliance, especially with, elections coming up in a lot of NATO countries and increasing questions from the U.S. on if a Republican candidate wins, if they would pursue, maybe leaving NATO or reducing their commitment to Europe. And so I think that's starting to explain a lot of Russian behavior, especially towards the Baltics, with the movement of their population, with the seemingly growing number of spy scandals as well, the arrests of prominent Russian spies, or at least prominent to us, people who were, professors for years and years in Russian studies.
So if Russia were to attack NATO, what do you think that would look like? I mean, can we make any broad predictions on the direction or strategy, and which country would be at the increased risk?
Yeah, it would. Russia's ability to attack NATO is a little bit more complicated now than it was before because of Sweden and Finland joining. Initially, it was basically assumed in the West, among NATO circles, that it would be the Baltic states, that Russia would attack the Baltic states and try and separate them, essentially, from the rest of NATO. And it would be very difficult for NATO to reinforce the Baltics before the Baltic states fell. This was the assumption. This wasn't necessarily the case. That's more complicated now because Finland adds a gigantic border with NATO. So it's still likely, probably the Baltics, probably Poland, that are at the most risk because Russia shares a large border with them, Belarus shares a large border with them. But it's more complicated now for Russia, just because there's now more allies and there's more preparation. These signs would look a lot like what the lead up to Ukraine looked like, where you see a massive mobilization of Russian forces. You would see
the trainings.
Trainings, disinformation, right? Claims that this is an exercise, and then probably an increase in hybrid tactics, right? So that would be disinformation, hacking, perhaps more more attempts to stir up discontent for Russian speaking populations within the Baltic states. So you would see a lot of activity. However, I think that for a long time there was an assumption that Russia could pull it off, that Russia could in 3 days, seize the
Take
Baltics
Kyiv.
and yeah, take Kyiv, right? Yeah, and this was a very strong assumption, and it's an assumption I saw repeated after the initial invasion from very prominent international relations scholars saying, oh, if you look at a map, Russia can obviously launch a surprise attack. But what we saw is, in the case of Ukraine, that everyone was very aware that there was Russian activity. The question was he going to go for it or was he going to back down?
Okay, let's say something happened, escalation, happened. Do you think Article 5 would be involved, or do you think NATO would come up with some bureaucratic loophole to, avoid war at all cost?
I think that a armed attack would trigger Article 5. I think that essentially the state that is being invaded has a decision. They can choose Article 4, which is consultation, or Article 5, which is rally around the flag. We've been attacked. Poland, for instance, invoked Article 4 when the missile fell in their territory for consultations, and Turkey does it all the time. But I think that a state like Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, they're very keyed into the threat Russia poses, and so I think that they would invoke Article 5 in the event of an armed attack.
Well, I guess I don't know if that's good news or bad news. It's a very difficult topic to figure out where the line is.
Yeah, it's striking a balance because essentially what NATO needs to do is prove to Russia that it's not worth invading NATO, that invading NATO or a NATO country pays no dividends, and so that requires a lot of posturing. But that posturing itself, from some circles can be seen as escalatory. For domestic populations, can be seen as escalatory. So it's about striking a balance between showing resolve and not yourself escalating into a conflict.
So would you say NATO is ready for war with Russia? How would anyone be able to assess the readiness?
Yeah. Well, I don't think anyone could be ready for a conflict of that magnitude. But I think that there are steps that NATO countries are taking for readiness. But this varies across the alliance. I think you see, for instance, Poland has shifted. I think they're spending nearly 4% of their GDP on defense now. And even smaller countries like Lithuania are interested in procuring tanks, which they had gotten rid of decades ago because they didn't think it was worth the cost. So there is an effort to establish readiness, and some of it goes back to 2014 at the Wales summit. One of the things that NATO did was they established the NATO Readiness Force, and this was an attempt to have some kind of rapid response if a crisis went down, and that's sort of evolved and still continues to this day. At the same time, I think there's a disconnect between the general population and perhaps military leadership. Military leadership in a lot of NATO countries emphasizes wanting bigger budgets, wanting increased defense. In the UK, there's increasing focus on the lack of manpower for specifically the army and recruiting issues. This led to some misperceptions about what some generals said and a lot of jokes about conscription coming back.
Yeah, I saw a lot of TikToks about that. People just kind of freaking out.
Yeah, it was kind of a strange scenario. I don't actually think that there will be conscription, but it was a general saying that there should be sort of societal readiness for a conflict. That societal readiness makes conflict less likely. And in the UK, the government decided to score some points by saying, no, there won't be conscription. And then everyone who could have been conscripted, which are 18 to 22-year-olds, immediately said, please don't conscript us on TikTok. So. Yeah, but in general, for readiness, there is movement there, but I think that very few NATO countries would say that they are ready. In some.
So in this hypothetical scenario, where is Ukraine left in this situation? Since so much of Russia's military is on Ukraine's territory, do you think NATO would fight back Russians inside Ukraine?
I think anything's possible in a full-blown high intensity conflict. I think that if Russia were to invade a NATO country, NATO would have to respond by like destroying Russia's ability to threaten NATO countries again. And I think that does mean supporting Ukraine more directly. And I'm hesitant about drawing comparisons to World War II and things like that. But in world wars, in large conflicts like that, you see people who aren't formally in an alliance cooperating closely, fighting alongside each other. So I think definitely that if there were a high intensity, full scale conflict between NATO and Russia, unless it immediately went nuclear in the sense that de-escalation had to happen or there would be a nuclear exchange. I think any conventional action would have to include Ukraine and would have to include Russians fighting in Ukraine and perhaps even Russians abroad in Africa and other places.
Do we know, what would that look like if something happens? Like how fast the response would be? Would we able to see some sort of response, or would it take months of discussion and deliberation between?
Yeah, well, the NATO Readiness Force, I believe is designed to respond pretty quickly, within 72 hours for the United States at least. You could see boots on the ground from Stuttgart in Germany and other places pretty quickly. I think it's those first couple days that are key. Because if Russia is able to, in the context of an invasion, if Russia were able to seize a lot of NATO territory in the same way that they seized a lot of Ukrainian territory, then NATO faces a lot of the same dilemma of how do we take it back, how fast can we take it back, and then the added how do we take it back without prompting a nuclear exchange. It's not quite as bad as some make out. It wouldn't take months and months of deliberation. NATO, from my experience, is a very bureaucratic and deliberative body. But we've only known a sort of a peacetime NATO, a NATO, at least in my experience, right, a NATO where there's no Soviet Union, and the alliance was trying to figure out, why they exist, what roles they can play in a world without great power competition, and now great power competition is back. So I think that as much as NATO loves deliberating, in a crisis, I think it'll be a very rapid response.
Well, yeah. I mean, is there a way for us to compare industrial military capability between Russia and NATO? I mean, does West have enough weapons, or can it produce them enough to match Russia? I'm asking because, a lot of stockpiles, Western stockpiles, have been given to Ukraine in the last 2 years, and production has been pretty slow.
Yeah, definitely, and that's another factor of readiness that I did neglect to talk about is this issue of weapons production. I mean, in terms of comparing economies on the biggest sense, NATO countries, I believe, are just under half of the world's GDP. So under half of the world's economy essentially comes from NATO. But obviously, most of that is oriented towards the civilian economy, right? Building Volkswagens and such. The question is, if there's some sort of crisis, if there's a long enough lead up between when a crisis starts and when a Russian invasion would happen, there would be a chance to ramp up production. But I think there would be some slim times in the middle. Essentially, I think that NATO has been holding back some of its stockpiles for its own defense to prevent this situation from happening. But at the same time,
That's fair.
a large number of NATO countries have donated a significant amount of their military stockpiles to Ukraine, and increasingly, sort of their focus has also been diverted a bit. More resources have gone into the Middle East as a result of several different, confrontations that are happening there. In the medium to long term, as soon as industry gets the sense that NATO governments are willing to shell out cash, they absolutely will shift production. They absolutely will, be able to very rapidly produce, and governments will be able to procure. But I guess there is a question mark over that first kind of month or so. I think Russia would actually very quickly find itself short of some of its most vital systems, its air defense, its aircraft, because NATO aircraft that haven't been fighting a war for so long. As much as we like to talk about stockpiles, I think NATO probably between them has probably 5 times as many planes as Russia does. So you could very quickly see a scenario where Russia is short of its high tech equipment and NATO is able to use more of its advanced things to as a force multiplier to get around maybe a short term shortage or maybe a short term bottleneck of things. And you might also see other actors coming in and sensing an opportunity. South Korea, for instance, has found it very profitable. That as a weapons exporter and as a weapons exporter that deals in NATO calibers for shells and other kinds of weapons. So yeah, I mean there is a risk in the early stages of a conflict of potential shortages, but at the same time, I think it's more of an open question. It's not necessarily a case of NATO soldiers, running out of ammunition on day 3. It's more a question in the medium term, I suppose.
Well, talking about soldiers, one of the other things that really differentiates Russia and the collective West is, when it comes to warfare, is their treatment of soldiers. I mean, we've seen Russia's willingness to use its hundreds of thousands of citizens as cannon fodder in this war in Ukraine. Do you think that would be a problem for NATO? Because Russia is an enormous country with a lot of people that they're seemingly happy to mobilize at their own, as much as they need to. That approach wouldn't really work in a democratic European country.
Yes. Well, historically there have been cases where democracies have mobilized. I think that in the context of an invasion where democracies have a sense that they are being attacked, you very quickly see populations get over it a bit. As much as TikTok in the UK complains about conscription, for instance, if the general population is afraid, you would very quickly see volunteers and mobilization. At the same time, NATO militaries tend to treat their soldiers a little bit better than Russia does.
That's good.
You would not, yeah, definitely. You wouldn't necessarily see human wave attacks. You wouldn't see an interest, and that's why most NATO countries invest so much in technology, is because they want to avoid a sort of a World War I situation where they throw an entire generation at the enemy and hope it works. So yeah, I mean, there's also the issue, I guess, of mass that if Russia, in the short term, already has a lot of soldiers conscripted, already has a lot of soldiers mobilized, that it will be challenging for the first NATO troops that engage them. There would be lots more Russians. However, in the medium to long term, you would start to see democratic nations passing conscription. You would start to see the fact that NATO countries overall have a larger population than Russia really start to tell. I think there is a question of Russia's use of civilians, in the sense that, if they're currently willing to threaten the Baltic's borders, right, by using their civilians as sort of migrants, right, as sort of a bargaining chip, would they be willing to complicate NATO's operations by having lots of civilians around in places that NATO is trying to bomb? And I think that could be challenging, because generally, despite NATO's reputation, generally they don't wish to bomb civilians. So that could be challenging as well. Russia's ability to mobilize its citizens and sort of spend their lives, willy-nilly, could be a challenge, but I don't necessarily think that it would be a game changer in a conflict between them.
Do you think, talking about conscription and mobilization, do you think there would be an issue, for example, for people be willing to fight when there's no war in their actual country? Because, Ukrainians are obviously defending our country and our freedom, and there's a very clear understanding why people have to be mobilized. I don't know if there's the same situation in Russia, but, when the war is not actually happening in your home country, is it a different, do you think there would be challenge there?
Yeah, I mean, I think from some corners, certainly, I think there would be people who, for ethical reasons, don't believe in war at all and would refuse to engage in it. I think that there would be sort of a why die for Danzig sort of crowd, which is, the sense of, the war's very far away. I live in the UK, I live in the US, I live in Portugal. Why should I go and fight? At the same time,
Yeah, I'll be safe here.
Yeah, exactly. At the same time, though, these countries are essentially obligated to go to war, and I think that given the way that the West reacted to the initial stages of the invasion of Ukraine, where I saw people who were 18 or 19 years old, because I was teaching at a university, very very overwrought, very emotional, very I think there would be a bit of a rally around the flag effect, and I think that the footage, right, would start coming out. You would see, on flooding on social media, you would see, the same things that happened in Ukraine, Lithuanian towns or Latvian towns or Estonian towns burned, and things like that. So
war
I think
crimes,
that
all of that.
yeah, war crimes, absolutely. I mean, when I was in Lithuania, I was given a handbook that they had for what to do in disasters, and it was heavily implied the disaster would be an invasion.
Wow.
And it was stuff like have a plan to leave the house, and some of it was, if you see occupying soldiers committing war crimes, record it and send it to the BBC. So so
Why didn't we have a
yeah.
handbook like that? I mean,
I, well, I'm wondering how widespread it was, because it was printed in English. So I'm wondering if they weren't handing it to me because I was visiting for a for a NATO thing. I think it's helpful to have a handbook like that generally, because it also applies to natural disasters. But yeah, I do think that NATO wouldn't have trouble getting a number of volunteers early on. I think conscription wouldn't necessarily be strongly opposed, particularly if there's a sense that I think it would also depend on messaging, right? I think governments do have to sell their populations and democracies on conflict, particularly conflict that's not necessarily on their border. But I think it's an increasingly easy case to make. Since Chechnya, since Georgia, since Syria, since Ukraine twice, it's quite clear that Russia is willing to is continues to be aggressive, isn't necessarily willing to
stop
back
at
down or
Ukraine.
stop at Ukraine, right? Or make reasonable what we consider to be reasonable decisions. That was a big problem in the West, is we thought and if we were Russia, we wouldn't invade Ukraine, so therefore Russia wouldn't invade Ukraine. And
Yeah, let's hope they're as good as we are.
yeah, exactly. But our hope failed us, I suppose. And so I think there is a lot more recognition now of the threat Russia poses.
Okay, so going back to the warfare, and the war in Ukraine has been highly technological. I've heard, I've seen many articles calling this the war of drones, and, new drones and technologies are being developed all the time. Do you think NATO would be able to keep up with this pace?
Yes and no. I think that the most interesting thing from especially the Ukrainian side of innovation is how decentralized it is, especially when it comes to drones. Right, the army of drones is not necessarily a bunch of identical drones all in a row made by the same company out of the same factory. It's a lot of people in small workshops.
Yeah, literally
Positing their
people
own
in their
ideas.
homes are creating drones for the soldiers in Ukraine.
Absolutely, and I've spoken with some more senior Ukrainian officials, and they basically said, yeah, that's by design. We've built requirements, and we've essentially worked in the idea that people in workshops might be submitting drones to us. That has trade-offs, of course, because you don't necessarily have the same level of standardization. It can be trickier to train people if one day they have one kind of drone, another time they have the next kind of drone. For NATO, I think there's a bit of an advantage in the sense that NATO enjoys a lot of technologically sophisticated systems at the start, but that tends to be in the realm of the F-35 or tanks. When it comes to small drones, like the kinds that Ukraine are using, there is a sense that they're behind, and there are efforts to rectify it, but these move at the pace of not at the pace of a bunch of citizens working together, but at the pace of government organizations and bureaucracies. I was talking
And
with
we know
one.
that doesn't work really fast.
Yeah, no, definitely not. It can, in emergencies. But the problem is Russia has shown that it's willing to, enter a crisis and invade very quickly. And there's a question of reaction time there as well. But I was talking with an officer in the UK military who is now his unit is now in the the NATO Readiness Force and specifically the very fast reaction force, the one that's supposed to be there in 24 hours. And he was saying for training, Ukraine uses 10,000 drones a month, right? It burns through 10,000 drones a month. For his training, his unit was given 50, and they had to not break any of them because the next unit had to use those drones. So there's a sense that they might be learning the lessons, but they're not necessarily responding very quickly. That said, some of the drones that were given to Ukraine, like the Switchblade, were longstanding U.S. technology. So it's possible to very quickly scale up, but the nature of crises is that they're sudden. So you would probably see a lot of NATO units go to war without the number of drones that a Ukrainian unit of similar size would have.
So what do you think NATO can learn from Ukrainian experience fighting against Russian?
I think there's been a lot of focus on Ukraine's tactical innovations and the tactical situation. So there's a lot more focus now on artillery, on mass, on drones. This idea that NATO had a longstanding idea that precision weapons could instead of having 100 unprecise weapons, you could have one precise weapon, and this would reduce costs and reduce the need for large numbers of munitions. But what Ukraine has shown is that even when there's precision weapons, you still need lots of mass, you still need lots of people, you still need lots of artillery. And so I think there's, I was talking earlier about the difference between what the population thinks and what the military thinks. The militaries are trying to adjust to this reality. It's not necessarily something populations are interested in yet, because it requires, if you want to buy a lot of shells, if you want to buy a lot of weapons, if you want to recruit a lot of people into the military, that means more budget, and that means more tax dollars. At least in the UK where I am, right, you have populations who, their mortgages are more expensive, electricity and power is getting more expensive. And so they're asking the question, why should my tax dollars go here? Why should my tax dollars go there? And it is the responsibility of those governments to pitch it, to sell it, to explain to their populations. But that's an uneven process across all of NATO's members.
So, the reason we wanted to have this conversation with you, because just over a week ago, NATO began its 2024 exercise Steadfast Defender, who is said to be the largest NATO exercise since the Cold War. How significant are these exercises, and do they tell us anything about NATO's approach to Russia and its threats?
I think what the exercise, and there are similar other exercises being conducted, although much smaller, is that the alliance is taking the prospect of conventional war with Russia much more seriously. You had NATO frequently did exercises prior, but they tended to be smaller in scale or focused on niche capabilities, focused on naval operations or joint counterterrorism or special forces, and this reflected NATO's priorities back then, which were operations like Libya, for instance, or the Balkans. Now NATO exercises are much more focused on conventional warfare in Europe, and so you see Steadfast Defender, and you see especially exercises in the Arctic, or sort of in the high north, aimed very much at this idea of Russian escalation and Russian invasion.
We're going to move to a question from our community. There's actually several, but I'm gonna ask you this one. So, are the Putin-friendly states ready to confront him in a military context and commit their military? With the context of, the right-leaning states have, throughout the conflict with Ukraine, drawn out negotiations and, displayed hesitancy to conflict with Russia and Russian interests.
This by Putin-friendly states, you mean sort of like the Hungaries, like members of NATO who are.
I'm assuming. Assuming that's what they meant.
I think that states like Hungary are take a different approach. I think definitely Hungary is a little bit more friendly to Putin than we would like. I don't necessarily think that they would ignore something as serious as Article 5, something as serious as a flagrant invasion. I think that they would join. I think that even if it's half-hearted, they would have to deploy their militaries. They're sort of obligated under treaty to do that. It would be very hard to tell what would happen if they didn't. I do think that we're somewhat lucky in that the number of NATO states that have any interest in dealing with Putin are fairly few. Even even when it comes to states like Slovakia, right, who just had an election and they elected someone much less. I would say, I don't want to say hostile to Ukraine, but definitely cooler on the idea of supporting Ukraine. They themselves are investing very heavily in defense and buying weapons from the U.S. So I think that when push comes to shove, I think that these states would join with NATO. I mean would fulfill their obligations to NATO as members. I guess the only thing to add would be this question of NATO readiness for hybrid warfare, and I've sort of brought this up, but I think that the best way to deter Russia is sort of showing resolve, is showing strength, and so being able to prevent little green men, or being able to stop cyber attacks or catch spies. These things are the prelude that would build Russian confidence that they could do an invasion at all. And so stopping those, being able to counter those effectively, is the first step to deterring Russia, in my view. And then I guess the very, very final thing would be understanding, I guess, getting a sense of what Russia would even want from an invasion of NATO at this point. If there was the widespread conception was that they would want the Baltics because between 1917 to 1991 they had occupied the Baltics, and they see it as Russian and they'd like it back.
Yeah, as their historic land.
But with the historic lands that didn't belong to them, where the people don't speak the language and don't share the culture. But but if Finland has now joined NATO, NATO is now much more ready than it was in 2014 and 2015. So if it's Russia's view that and Putin's view, and I'm not saying that it is, but if it were their view that they wouldn't be able to secure the Baltics, that they wouldn't be able to gain much by launching an invasion, the odds of an outright war are significantly lower. So I think that's another thing to consider, is how confident is Russia that they could get something from a war with NATO.
Marcel, thanks so much for coming to the show. We're really happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me on.
You can find this show on YouTube and all audio platforms every Friday. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to like, comment wherever you listen to this podcast. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss a new episode. Please support the Kyiv Independent by donating or becoming a member of our community. You can do that by going to kyivindependent.com/membership and becoming a member. Also, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.